Welcome to my scientifically informed insider look at mental health topics. If you find this video to be interesting or helpful, please like it and subscribe to my channel. Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question is, what is the difference between the dark traits and the vulnerable dark traits? To help answer this question, I'll be using an article that was published in 2017 by Edwards and colleagues, and I'll put the reference to this article in the description for this video. Now, the dark traits and the vulnerable dark traits are traits that are connected to criminality. And in theory, they are differentially connected, meaning the dark traits predict certain types of criminal activities and the vulnerable dark traits predict other types of criminal activities. And that's what this particular article was really about. Now, this whole topic of dark traits and vulnerable dark traits is a little confusing because of the term triad. A lot of times when we hear this, we hear of the dark triad and the vulnerable dark triad. But just like the traits, there's no single agreed upon definition for the dark triad or vulnerable dark triad. One popular definition of the dark triad would be that there's three traits here: psychopathy, narcissism, and Machiavellianism. But this particular theory, to some extent, has fallen out of favor because Machiavellianism doesn't appear to be a distinct construct. I talk about this in a prior video about the dark triad. The dark triad conceptualization I'll be using here, the one we see in this article, has the interpersonal and affective psychopathic traits along with grandiose narcissism. And the vulnerable dark triad, the three traits here would be the lifestyle psychopathic traits, vulnerable narcissism, and borderline personality traits. So I'm going to take a quick look here at psychopathy, narcissism, and borderline personality disorder, and then come back and talk about how these traits are associated with the dark triad and vulnerable dark triad again. So with psychopathy, we see with this construct there are two factors, factor 1 and factor 2. Each of these factors has two facets. So factor 1 psychopathy, you have interpersonal and affective facets. So on the interpersonal side, we see traits like superficial charm, grandiosity, pathological lying, and being manipulative. On the affective side, we see traits like lack of remorse, lack of empathy, and callousness. So looking at the interpersonal and the affective together, again, this is factor 1, and factor 1 is associated with a low level of agreeableness and a high level of extroversion on the 5-factor model. Now, looking at factor 2, this factor is referred to as the social deviance factor, and again, it has two facets. Here we have lifestyle and antisocial. Now, at the lifestyle facet, we see characteristics like impulsivity and irresponsibility. And with the antisocial facet, we see characteristics like poor behavioral controls and criminal versatility. Again, lifestyle and antisocial taken together, this is factor 2, social deviance. And with factor 2, in terms of the 5-factor model, again, we see a low level of agreeableness, just like we did with factor 1. But here we see a low level of conscientiousness, low level of extroversion, and a high level of neuroticism. Now, moving to the construct of narcissism. Now, narcissism can be divided into two factors: grandiose, sometimes referred to as overt, and vulnerable, sometimes referred to as covert or hypersensitive. With grandiose narcissism, we see characteristics like arrogance, a sense of entitlement, and being socially bold. Here we see it's associated with a high level of extroversion. With vulnerable narcissism, we see characteristics like being resentful, hypersensitive, having social insecurity, being defensive and avoidant. It's associated with a low level of extroversion. So we have psychopathy, narcissism, and the last construct I'll cover before I get to the traits would be borderline personality disorder or borderline personality traits. And of course, there's a lot of overlap between these two constructs. With borderline personality disorder, we see a variety of symptoms, including a fear of abandonment, identity disturbance, impulsivity, anger, a chronic feeling of emptiness, and a few other characteristics. So we can see that psychopathy, narcissism, and borderline personality traits can have negative consequences. There are a lot of unpleasant emotions and behaviors associated with these different constructs. Now, again, with the dark traits or the dark triad, we see the interpersonal and affective facets, that's factor 1 of psychopathy, and we see grandiose narcissism. With the vulnerable dark traits, or vulnerable dark triad, we see the lifestyle psychopathic traits from factor 2, but not the antisocial, and we see vulnerable narcissism and borderline personality traits. With the dark traits, we see low levels of agreeableness, high levels of extroversion, and low levels of neuroticism. And with the vulnerable dark traits, we see low levels of agreeableness. This is in common with the dark traits. But here we see low levels of extroversion and high levels of neuroticism. So again, here we see that dark traits and vulnerable dark traits seem to have this relationship to criminality, and that's what this study is about. And you'll notice the antisocial facet of factor 2 psychopathy was not included, and that's because partially what makes up this particular facet is a criminal history. So this was excluded from this analysis and excluded from the definition of vulnerable dark traits. So what were the results from this particular study? Well, we see with this study they had almost 500 participants, and they divided crime up into crimes against property, crimes against persons, and drug-related offenses. And again, I've already talked about the definitions of dark triad and vulnerable dark triad as they used them here. So what we saw here with these findings is that the dark triad, the dark traits, as opposed to the vulnerable dark traits, were associated with all types of criminal activity. And the dark traits were related to violent crimes, but the vulnerable dark traits were not related to violent crimes. The vulnerable dark traits were more strongly related to property crimes and drug offenses. Now, some of the criminal activity categories really seem to be associated with both dark traits and vulnerable dark traits, like threatening and intimidation behavior, as well as fraud. So we see here that when you take the dark traits and the vulnerable dark traits together, they contribute to 8 to 18% of the unique variance of the crime categories. So what this means is that these traits only explain this limited percentage of criminal behavior. A lot of other factors need to be taken into account to predict criminal behavior, like contextual adversity. But still, even with this particular contribution, knowing the behavior associated with these different traits can help identify at-risk individuals and theoretically could be used to prevent crime. I hope you found this description of the dark traits and vulnerable dark traits to be interesting. Thanks for watching.